Hello and welcome. Welcome everybody. Welcome on this last day of March. Can you believe it? Time has been flying. All right. Welcome everybody to our fourth deeper dive. Tonight we're going to be talking about the federal policy periods with a very, very special spotlight on a very special person and event. I'm Jennifer Statham. I'm from the Montana Office of Public Instruction, Indian Education for All unit. And I am very pleased to introduce my facilitators this evening who have been fabulous throughout this deeper dive series. We've just taken all of your feedback and shared it with them, and they just continue taking all of the requests and incorporating them the best that they can. So thank you ladies very much for making this amazing. And here we go with Miranda Murray and Jordan Langston Forster.
Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome back, everybody. We're so excited to have you back. We have a lot of information to cover tonight. If you participated in the Essential Understanding Unpacking series for Essential Understanding number 5, either most recently or the first time around, you'll know that the federal policy is a lot to cover. So we have a lot of exciting stuff to share with you tonight.
By a lot to cover, she means just 500 years. So it's really not that big of a deal, but we hope you were something comfortable tonight. I'm Jordan Lankford Forster. My Aani name is Bright Trail Woman. We are educational, I almost said consultants. We're that too for Bright Trail, but our actual job during the day is we are Indian Education for All instructional coaches for our district in Great Falls, Montana. I also run a dropout prevention program for American Indian students in Great Falls called Intertribal Immersion, where we incorporate and infuse cultural and indigenous information into all of our content during the day. So we want to thank OPI for having us and allowing us to facilitate this. The unpacking series that Miranda was talking about is more about just kind of simplifying and breaking down those essential understandings because they're multifaceted, multi-layered.
A little bit of history,
a little bit
background knowledge.
Just 500. It's 500 years is not a big deal. And then our deeper dive allows us to kind of go into lesson ideas and content specific to more grade level and things that are appropriate for you and your classroom. Don't feel like you have to do everything exactly how we present them. Just you can take little bits and pieces of it and use it in a way that makes sense for your classroom or whatever it is that you do. We know we have a lot of people on here too that do all sorts of things, state parks, libraries, stuff like that. So hopefully you can take the information back and use it in whatever way is applicable for you. So with that, we are going to start. And we just want to revisit this timeline. So this is the timeline concerning federal Indian policy. For us, we feel that it's very important to acknowledge time immemorial. That is, as long as the grass has grown and the river has flown and the winds have blown.
Very poetic. That was very
and scene. But we just think that it's really important to acknowledge that there were goings on before that 1492 start date and then the continuation of federal policy. Just a couple moments here to observe this timeline and observe that federal Indian policy, some of these policies still continue today. A lot of these policies overlap, which means they conflict with each other. And we just wanted to start out this way, acknowledging this timeline. So as we move through our presentation tonight, maybe a couple of things will make a little bit more sense, but I think it's just important to acknowledge this timeline. And as we start to work through the different facets of it, that it wasn't a timeline that flowed together. And it doesn't mean that when certain federal policies started, other ones stopped. They are overlapping, they are conflicting, which has made it difficult for American Indian communities at times to really grasp onto their sovereignty and be able to operate in that way.
Yeah. As we are getting ready to look at our vocab, you'll hear us mention this a couple of times throughout the presentation, either live or in some of the videos, that really giving your students the opportunity to see this timeline as well, and visually understand that when you're seeing a list of dates like this, like below, the way it's listed in the essential understandings, it's helpful to have accuracy, but it also doesn't really give you a good sense of that overlap or those conflicting policies that Jordan was just explaining. So we are going to get started with our vocabulary for the evening.
Hello, friends. Welcome back. By now, you should know, if you've joined us this whole time, that this is the part of the show where we show you the fun and fascinating vocabulary for essential understanding number 5. Federal policies, laws from the highest level of government.
Regulate, or to control. American Indians have been the most regulated and controlled group in the history of our country.
Colonization, also known as the colonial period. Establishing communities in a land that is not your own, using land that is not yours for your own personal gain or economic benefit.
Treaty making and removal. Treaty making refers to the legal agreements among two governments establishing boundaries. Removal refers to American Indian people being removed from the land through agreements, but in most cases, forcefully removed.
Reservation, allotment, and assimilation. Reservations were land reserved by tribes for tribes. During the allotment period, land on reservations was divided into parcels of 160 acres and assigned to each head of household. This created an extreme land shortage and poverty on reservations. After the land was divided and assigned, the surplus land was sold to non-native settlers. Assimilation. When the majority culture absorbs the minority culture. Through controlling boundaries, food supplies, education, how they made their money and worked, prohibited religion and traditional practices, American Indians were attempted to be assimilated into European American culture.
Tribal reorganization. This was established by the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934. It was determined that assimilation was not working and aimed to decrease federal control over tribes and gave some control back to the tribes. It created job service programs on reservations and was meant to strengthen sovereignty.
Termination and relocation. Termination was meant to end the federal relationship with tribes and no longer recognize them as separate entities. Relocation was a program that encouraged and funded tribal members to move off reservations and into larger cities across the country, therefore assimilating them.
Self-determination. This was the ending of the termination period in 1975. Following the Civil Rights Movement, American Indians wanted the same rights as all other U.S. citizens. This act allowed for self-governance and allowed tribes and leaders to make decisions for their people. So just a reminder that language and vocabulary is super important to be able to incorporate constantly throughout IFA and other curricular areas that you're bringing up these kind of similar vocabulary words. You're going to hear me talk a little bit about academic language later on, and those are all primary examples of academic language we're not using in our everyday conversation, but we want you to be using in your everyday conversation with your students.
And again, you can use those words, turn them into flashcards. You can simplify them for the younger grades, whatever makes sense to you, but also you can do a word wall, whatever makes sense for your class. You don't even have to use all of those words, or you can add on to it too. Those are just what we find when we're talking about and we're teaching about Essential Understanding 5, that it's really important for students to understand the vocabulary before we explain to them the concept. Also, this is just free information. I don't know if anyone out there hears the sound of their own voice and they're like, is that what I sound like? I go through this range of emotions every time we do the vocab because I'm like, is that how I sound? So anyway, just a little bit more of my voice.
Thanks for listening to
the sound of my voice.
All right, we're also going to jump right into our traditional game, Sticks in a Fist.
All right, so tonight we're going to show you another game. This game originates from the Anishinaabe, also known as Chippewa people, and it is called Sticks in a Fist. It is very well named because it's exactly like it sounds, but what you're going to do is you're going to have 10 sticks. You can either use, longer sticks and paint this bottom part of it. So the 9 other sticks are blank and this 10th one is painted. Or if you want to simplify it, you can use popsicle sticks. An important part of this though is that you want all of your sticks to look all the same, so there's not any indicators of which stick is marked. And what you do is you have a person, you hold them like this so that colored part is covered with your hand. And to make it challenging too, you can change like the height of the stick, but one by one the person draws. Miranda didn't draw the marked one, so she gets to keep going. She drew it. This is a really fun game, again, for kids to do during, quiet time, or if they finish their work early, indoor recess. It's also worked well in terms of graphing with students when you start having conversations with, well, how many times out of 5 did, can you splice that? Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you say something about science and statistics and graphing, or I don't know?
Sure.
Okay.
Another way that we use this game is in math when we talk about graphing and probability, how many sticks are left, what are your chances of pulling the stick that's marked. And it's a great way for kids to practice quick math while also playing a game.
I needed Miranda to help me out because sometimes we get going on the games and then I forget what I'm going to say. But as Miranda stated when she came and saved the day for me, is that it's a great way, a tool if you're talking about statistics, if you want to incorporate that in your class too. I don't know why I suggested this game for quiet time though. I apologize about that because it's not a quiet game, but it is very exciting in a very simple way. Also, kids are very engaged when they get to make their own set of sticks in a fist. It's just really important to make sure that the long side of the sticks all look the same, so there's not indicators or markers on there where they know which one might be marked. So
thank you. We are keeping it real over here. All right. So our featured person for Essential Understanding number 5 for federal policy is Deb Haaland. And most recently being known for her appointment to, and on March 15th, she was sworn in as the 54th Secretary of the Interior. Secretary Deb Haaland has made history several times. First, when she was one of the 2 first Native American women to serve in Congress, and then when she became the first Native American woman to serve as a cabinet secretary. She is a member of the Pueblo of Laguna and a 35th generation New Mexican. Secretary Haaland ran her own small business producing and canning Pueblo salsa, served as a tribal administrator at the San Felipe Pueblo, and became the first woman elected to the Laguna Development Corporation Board of Directors, overseeing business operations of the 2nd largest tribal gaming enterprise in New Mexico. She successfully advocated for Laguna Development Corporation to create policies and commitments to environmentally friendly business practices. Throughout her career in public service, Secretary Haaland has broken barriers and opened doors of opportunity for future generations. After running for New Mexico Lieutenant Governor in 2014, Secretary Haaland became the first Native American woman to be elected to lead a state party. She is one of the first Native American women to serve in Congress, and in Congress she focused on environmental justice, climate change, missing and murdered Indigenous women and people, and family-friendly policies.
A really great resource that I use that also articulates federal Indian policy well, just not in Montana, but throughout the United States, is a resource called Indian Country Today. And it's a free online news outlet. So you can access articles and stuff for free, but I use it in my class. Again, I teach high schoolers and I usually do at least one article a week. And it does a really good job of combining current events with federal Indian policy. So what I'm going to talk about right now is this article that we did a couple of weeks ago. Again, it was on Indian Country Today. I'm going to have Miranda hold that. Sorry,
Go ahead.
hold it. Don't hold it. Not yet. What Jennifer put in the chat is that OPI just came out as of a couple moments ago with a lesson concerning Deb Haaland, and it's called A New Day at the Department of the Interior, and it's found on that IAFA website and under the social studies link. So the article that I'm gonna hold it. Thank you, Miranda. The article that I use with my class found on Indian Country Today. It is also very important that when you are sharing articles with your students, you share who wrote them, right? You want to give credit where credit is due. So this article is called Tribes Have High Hopes as Haaland Confirmation Hearing Nears. And this was published obviously before the confirmation hearing. It was published in February, but it's a great example of a contemporary issue. And to begin with, we identify the source of the article. This particular article was from the Associated Press that Indian Country Today picked up. Sources are important to keep in mind when we think critically about publications and how opinion pieces differ, because Indian Country Today does offer a lot of opinion pieces. And also opinion pieces have a tendency to insert emotion. And not opinion pieces are bad or wrong or misguided, but I want my students to analyze all material in a way that honors multiple perspectives. And so really differentiating those data objective pieces with opinion pieces is really important, especially while you're critically digesting it. Your conversations too can be as political or non-political as you want. So this could be a supplemental reading piece while you were discussing presidential cabinets. What does a cabinet do? What is the purpose of a cabinet? How many cabinet positions are there? What do the other positions oversee? And the purpose of the Secretary of the Interior. What is the purpose of the Secretary of the Interior? What are the roles and responsibilities of the Secretary of the Interior? How does the Interior Department affect tribes or land? So things like federal relations with tribes, federal recognition, mineral and resources rights, national parks, to just name a few. And other topics that this particular article covered was sovereignty and tribes' ability to govern separately and independently, concerning the differences in consent versus consultation. So what does it mean for tribes to actually give consent versus consultation, their feelings or how their opinions on a specific policy, and the goings on within the reservation boundaries. This article also talks about the Keystone and Dakota pipelines, the Bears Ears National Monument, Mount Rushmore and Chaco Canyon, and the US government and upholding the stewardship agreement with tribes. And just again, Indian Country Today, it's a wonderful source for contemporary issues. And for the most part, articles are interlaced with that historical federal policy and why it matters or how it's still affecting tribes today. A big piece of that Essential Understanding 5 is that although some federal policies have ended, that doesn't mean that the consequences of them have ended. And a lot of those consequences of a lot of federal policies are still seen today. And I just really believe that Indian Country Today does a really good job of interlacing those things in a way that is contemporary. It makes sense to kids, but also does a really good job on touching on the historical aspects of the content that they share as well.
I'm sure Jennifer, if she hasn't yet had a chance to, will add the link to this as well in your resource folder so that you can go back and access that lesson that is hot off the presses. And we had a moment to kind of look at it before our time together tonight, and there is a lot of great aspects that you're going to be able to feature or take apart. You can take it apart and use different parts of it or do it as a whole unit. Lots of great contemporary issues to be featured in that lesson. All right.
We are going to share now how look at that face. All right. Gorgeous. This is what I call political cartoon analysis. So this will be a video that, again, I use with my older students and how we analyze images or cartoons concerning federal policy.
As it turns out, when studying the art of social studies, not all students are super amped all of the time to read a book or an article or information. So another thing that I do in my class when we're talking about social studies, particularly current events, is I use images to support small group and then class discussions. This is an example of an image I would use as part of a conversation starter and small group and then whole group discussion. So this screenshot was taken a day or so after the voting closed in our most recent election, and it actually is an exit poll that they took in Arizona, and it displays the different demographics that they polled and their outcomes concerning who voted for who. So when I introduced this, I ask them to answer questions either on their own and then share out in a group, and then we do a whole group discussion. So I always ask them pretty much the same formatted questions. So what's going on in this image or photo, or maybe even a political cartoon? What is the message that it's sending? And then also, what potentially are the consequences of this image or political cartoon? So if people are seeing it for the first time, what conclusions might they draw on their own? What are the consequences of that? So I had a really great group discussion with my students when this came out, and obviously we talked about the something else phrase that was used, and we talked about, how that might impact other people living across the United States who see this image. What conclusions might they draw about something else? Obviously, we have a discussion about why the phrase American Indian or Native American wasn't used in this imagery. All sorts of things like that. And the students they say way smarter things than I'm even thinking most of the time, but just that natural conversation of, okay, so we have this current event, this contemporary thing going on, and then relating it back to historical events or imagery of why might people across the country not even be aware that American Indian people still exist? Could an image like this, potentially continue that narrative of, well, I didn't even know that American people even were around today, right? And it's just a great way to tie in multiple essential understandings and also keep it in a contemporary setting that the students are really engaged in.
Something else. Can we take a moment to respond and reflect in the chat some of those questions that I ask my class? So what message is the something else? What might it be sending? Also, too, I think it's important to reflect, and hopefully we have some participants do that in the chat. What does it mean for American Indian people who are at home and see an image like that in 2020? How might that affect non-Native people, or how might it affect Native people? Thank you for some of those responses. Give a couple more moments. If anyone else would like to reflect what message images like that send to Native or non-Native. Yeah, and so what's interesting about that image too is that the folks that were reported as Asian were reported on less than the something else category. So I think the Asian population that participated in that exit poll was at 3%, something else was polled more than that, 6%, I believe, and the Asian people were still named. They still walked away from that with an identity. Yeah, we talked about that too, differentiating.
Asia is a large place.
Yeah. Africa. Absolutely. Thank you for everyone who responded. And again, whatever makes sense to your class, but I just teach high schoolers. And like I said in the video, it turns out high schoolers aren't always amped on reading a bunch of stuff sometimes, but they do respond to those images. So what I have on the board is also available in the resource folder. And when I know that I don't know what policies different schools have, but in some classrooms in our district, it's a policy to start them off with what they call a bell ringer. So I might have an image up on the screen and this sheet that students can fill out, and it can be used with political cartoons or memes. I've heard that the children really respond to those as well, but it can be easily connected to federal Indian policy era is normally the political cartoons that I take. I advise to stay away from making fun of specific tribes. That gets a little sticky, and it doesn't bring our students any closer to self-actualization. But the beginning of this is I present an image and identify the creator, the source, or the title if there is one. I have students identify what characters are involved. So what are they doing? What action is taking place? I have them identify which policy era this cartoon is referencing. How do you know? What context clues are you using? Then I have a list that they can choose from, because some political cartoons or memes actually cover multiple federal policy time eras. So I have time immemorial, colonization, treaty, removal, reservation, allotment, assimilation, reorganization, termination, relocation, self-determination. Then I also ask what stereotypes or markers are being used and how, like, how do we know that this is talking about a specific group of people? I have a explore section. So what is the message? What is the point? Why did the creator feel like this was important to be made? And then also, what is the opposing side of this message? So what's the opposition to this message? And then also a reflection section. So do you agree with this message? Why or why not? Can you identify with both sides of this message? Why or why not? So identify meaning, can you understand the point of both sides of this argument? That's a really important piece of critical thinking. And I never want my students to feel like they're only going to get the answer right if they think how I think. I just want them to be able to have that empathy piece where they can see both sides of the story, because it's not always about who's less right and who's more right. It's about being able to have conversations with each other and being able to have conversations with individuals who have a different perspective than you. That's where real critical thinking and decision-making skills come to play. And I think that's really important in education. So again, this sheet is in the resource file.
In the one aptly titled "Participants Look Here." Jen had a great title for that, so that you can easily find it, but it is in with that Essential Understanding number 5 folder. So that you could have access to this resource and use it as well. I see in the chat someone was commenting that they use the Essential Understandings for part of their bell ringers. So this would be a great addition if your students are already thinking and talking about those different essential understandings. This would be a great way to kind of switch it up and continue those kinds of conversations and strengthen their understanding of those essential understandings. And again, like, sorry, I also just was thinking about, like, when Jordan was saying that the federal policies overlap and they might be referencing more than one, you could, like, also talk about what essential understandings, if your students are at a point where you've been talking about them long enough and they have had time to learn them and understand them, that they might also be able to talk about, you know, where does this fit in our essential understandings as well.
Yeah, you can, and If you just want to use this sheet as a reference too, and you can come up with something better, go for it. This is just kind of a place to start. I made these charts myself. So, you know, use them if you want to. If you don't, it's okay. You might have thought of something way more inventive than I did.
So we're kind of, I don't want to say jumping around, but we have, like we've said at the beginning, we have a lot of different eras and federal policy to touch on and to come out for lesson plans. So this next video you're going to see is a way to talk about boarding schools and kind of figuring out how to utilize the insane amount of books and videos and interviews and resources that are out there for boarding schools. Sometimes that can be overwhelming. So this video will introduce that topic for you.
So whenever we're talking about boarding schools, this is a great opportunity to incorporate the many available resources in book format to talk about boarding schools and the boarding school experience. So all of the lesson plans that you're going to find books, you're going to find videos, you're going to find documentaries and interviews. So there is a huge amount of information out there about boarding schools, and this is one of the ways to kind of bring it more cohesively together instead of just trying to pick one resource to use in your classroom. So what I do is I gather, you could do this with many different subjects or content areas, especially in IFA because there's so many book resources available. I gather the books that I want to feature. And so all of these books, which are on your resource list in your participation folder, have to do with boarding school. They're different, they're firsthand accounts, they're historical fiction, there are story-based, there are beautiful illustrations. This is a chapter book, but it's written in letter format. And so what you can do is you can do this as an activity where students are broken up into stations and they're visiting each book station, and that can be your lesson. Or it can be something, if you're in a situation maybe at an elementary level where you have students working on different things throughout the day and they have some time, you might have these stations kind of pre-set up in your classroom. And students know that if they finish work early, then their job is to go visit one of the books they have not seen yet. And so that might be a way to gather information for your students to get that kind of pre-knowledge in before you even start reading or talking about boarding schools from the teaching perspective. So a couple of different ways to do that. And so what I do is I make something like this where it's a big piece of paper, it's with the book. This says, leave a comment, question, concern, or aha. We kind of talk about what those might mean and talk about that it's okay if you read something, if you have more questions than ideas about what's happening, because that's going to improve our students' learning. And oftentimes if they have questions, other students have questions, and to be able to articulate that. Depending on your grade level, I do ask students to sign the paper so that I know that they've been there, A, especially if I'm doing this independently, and B, to make sure that I have all appropriate comments, questions, or concerns being left on my sheets. And so what you end up with is something like this, where we have people making comments about how they enjoyed the book, or questions or topic connections, or maybe connections to other learning in our classroom. So really great opportunity for students to understand and think about a collection of books and their topics as they relate to one another, but also to be able to convey their own ideas about what's happening. So great resource to use, great activity to do, and you can do this with a lot of different kinds of books.
So like I said in the video, in the realm of boarding school, I know there are a lot of teachers in our elementaries that are doing whole units on boarding schools, and they're looking at all of those different books as ways to introduce information. I have some teachers that will do this as like a anticipatory set, so that they can have students kind of gathering their own personal knowledge. Because sometimes when you're going to teach something that students haven't learned about before, they don't have anything to build on necessarily. And our students especially at a younger age. And depending on what they received when they were like in middle school, when they get to high school, they might not have a background or a schema built yet of what boarding schools are. Or if they don't have any an understanding of Native American boarding schools, they might be able to make some connections to their understanding of boarding schools and what they see in movies and film or personal experiences with that. But using this as a way to give students the opportunity to build their own background by reading books. I especially like to use this when it's an independent kind of study thing where they're doing it at their own pace, because then you're getting individual students reading, giving them more opportunity to read material that might be unfamiliar, and different kinds of material, different genres move together. The other thing that I like about this, if you do it in a as a classroom activity, you can put kids into small groups and have more language being spoken, because at each table you can give, let's say you have a small group of 4 and you have different jobs. There might be a reader at that table and they're going to read the book and present it to their classmates. You might have someone who takes down their discussion topics. If they discuss questions, they might be the recorder who writes down the questions for their group, or the ideas they had to document their time at that station.
It just depends on how you have your class structured. And I know during this time of COVID, it might be difficult too, but you can also front load them with these questions that Miranda was talking about and have them check out books for homework as well.
Yeah, and you can do this with other topics as well. I like the idea also of using this with maps, this kind of station situation, because I'm going to show you some resources with maps at the end of our time today, but we've looked together at some of those interactive maps. You could have different stations that show maps during different time periods and how they've changed over time, what's going on when you're there. You could even do that at the high school level. If you've had more pre-teaching, that might be a cool activity to get kids up and thinking and connecting what they've learned about what we've talked about to a map. What does this look like? What's going on at this time? So very versatile project, and students obviously love to get up out of their chairs and do something other than sit and be talked at. I don't like to sit and be talked at either, so we try and keep it rolling. The next thing I want to talk about when we're talking about federal policy and ways to incorporate this in the classroom is sometimes elementary folks can feel overwhelmed as to how to incorporate federal policy at the younger level, and it can seem intimidating because there are some kind of heavy, broad, complex subjects to be talking about, topics to be talking about. And one of the things that I really enjoy that some of our really young, like first grade teachers do to incorporate federal policy is they talk about the Discovery Doctrine. So we're talking about colonization and that long bar, having conversations when you're introducing this about how that is started really early on and has continued on for a long time. But she uses the Discovery Doctrine to talk about how land has been acquired. And so we haven't necessarily got a chance to talk a ton about the Discovery Doctrine in our time together, but it was a document that was used to acquire land. And there are different parts of it that when you simplify what it's saying down to common language, it's kind of like a finders keepers. If I'm here first, if you're not using the land, then I get to come and take over that land, those kind of different things. And she introduces the different parts of the doctrine of discovery, and then they use it to take over their neighboring classrooms. So they might wait till second grade's out at recess or a different grade level if they have different recess times. And then they will take their Discovery Doctrine and they will go take over the other classroom, and they'll sit in the seats, and then they'll explain to the other kids. Usually this is kind of a collaborative effort. They'll explain to the other kids when they come back from recess why that desk and that chair is now theirs, because you weren't using it. I didn't see anyone around, so obviously it was land open for the taking, or objects open for the taking. And students really obviously enjoy that, but they're also cementing learning in a realistic way. Those kids are going to remember what that meant. And so when that gets brought up again later on in a more complex way, where you're taking deeper dives into those topics, they're going to have something to build on, and they're going to say, I know what that means because this is something that we did. And we even just sometimes when we're teaching adults in our classrooms, when we're teaching professional development, we always plan that when we've been teaching about the doctrine of discovery, to have like a short break where people can get up, walk around, go use the bathroom right after that. And then while they're gone, we'll take their chairs and be like, sorry, you weren't using it. It's ours now. And if you need to understand why, here is a document that it gives me the right to do that.
I do the same thing to my high school students as well. But that doctrine of discovery, the Discovery Doctrine, has been upheld as legal for all. I mean, I think the last one that we've researched was 2016.
Yeah, it was pretty recent.
Claiming of unoccupied or inappropriately used land.
Yeah. And I feel like it's hard to condense down to what we want to share with you. And it is really fun to investigate what that document says and look at it from simplified terms. When we're talking with
it's a good question.
Does it extend to other planets? I don't know. It definitely,
I'm sure the Supreme Court would agree. They would say
no one's using
probably
it.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's kind of like how it's happening anyways. Random countries go up and they're like, I'm going to build this thing, unowned space,
unoccupied space,
as far as we know. But it is interesting to think about that this document that was made up by a European government, or European church really, is still upheld and used as a way to claim land or keep claim to land, because it says things like, if the land isn't occupied, then you can claim it for your country. If you build a fort on it, then you have claim to the land all the way around you in a circle for a certain amount of time. If you find the mouth of a body of water or a mouth of a river, then you have all the tributaries down below it as claim to your land. And it really gave permission to European settlers to come and take land. And it was interesting because it acknowledged Native occupancy and that Native people were there, by saying, like, you can't buy the land because it's not occupied, so you just automatically get it. But if you wanted, like, if the Native people wanted to sell it to you, they could, but they also don't get to not sell it to you because you get to take it over. It's a very contradictory document. So if you want to know more about that, you can certainly do some research. It is a really great way to introduce federal policy and talk about that first time period of colonization with students at any age.
And it's always important, as we discussed during the unpacking series for number 5, it's always important when you're looking at any federal policy to see, first of all, who wrote it. Not only what does it say, but also who does it benefit more, because any federal policy regarding American Indians or not, any federal policy benefits a specific group of people more than another group of people. And so it's really interesting to see that these federal policies or these federal laws were written on behalf of the United States, and more often than not seem to benefit the United States more so than the other group of people.
All right. Do you want to introduce this next video?
Sure. I don't know what it is, but
it's
okay.
Goes right into what we're talking about, really.
I knew what was happening. So with that, I'm going to, I'm just sitting here. Miranda's going to show you here in a couple of seconds a timeline activity that I do with my students. We also use it in professional development with educators, but it's just a really great way to introduce the aspects of these contradicting federal policies. So we'll take you through that and then we'll debrief it here in a sec.
So a way that I teach federal Indian policy in my social studies class is I like to start off with activities or concepts that kind of tilt the schema, kind of questions the things that we think are true. And so I have created, I give them to them, I already cut them up, but what they are is they are words or word phrases, events that happened in accordance to federal Indian policy. They're mixed up when I give them to the students and they're just paper clipped together. With a partner, I ask them to, in order from very first thing that happened to most recent, I have them put on a piece of construction paper what they think the order of federal Indian policy events are. I do not have them glue it down at first because they're usually wrong, but I have them put in order what they think the timeline of events was. So starting with 1492 and how federal policy unfolded, I just give them bits and pieces and they can follow that timeline starting with colonialization. I would also recommend that you go before that and talk about time immemorial and self-sufficiency. Great way to hit on EU 1 and 2 and that tribes were living successfully for millennia before federal Indian policy. So this is just a really great way for them to visualize the order of events, because when you look at numbers on a chart, kind of gets discombobulated and blurred together. This is a great way for them to talk with each other what they think happened first and then most recent. So I have a day 1 and a day 2, and day 1 covers from colonization to treaty, reservation, assimilation, and allotment, and then also goes through Indian reorganization. And then day 2 is a little bit of Indian reorganization, followed by termination and relocation, and then into self-determination. So it's not necessary to follow exactly my order of events. I just included things from federal policy that I find important. Something that I also do too is I put in recognizable markers of things that students are already familiar with, events that they already know about. So World War I, World War II, other things like that. It can be anything, just already recognizable events, because then it kind of builds a schema within the students. So when I put World War I here, then it might surprise them that even though American Indian people fought in World War I, it wasn't until the Snyder Act of 1924 that Congress grants citizenship to all American Indians born within the United States. I also create a cheat sheet of my own just so I can add in fun facts and details once we're working through the timeline. So again, don't have them glue it down until you go through it and explain to the groups what needs to be changed, and then you can have the students glue it down, because if they glue it down and it's inaccurate, that's a disaster. So this is my final day. I have World War I, I have the Snyder Act. American Indians are granted the right to vote. That's also surprising for students following their participation in World War I. And I include for my fun fact that not all states complied. It wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act protected and reaffirmed and strengthened this right, 6 years after World War I. Work service programs created in reservation communities, but I added for my detail that I'm giving them is this is also a response to the Great Depression and the effort put on the whole community to get back to work. I talk about Indian reorganization and the IRA, how it was also a form of paternalism. Then I have a recognizable marker, which is World War II. And my fun or interesting fact is Joe Medicine Crow accomplishes the 4 tasks of counting coup, making him the last war chief of the Crow and ultimately the last Plains war chief. Then I have Indian removal 2. That's what I call termination and relocation. I just think it's interesting for the students to understand that tribes were moved several times throughout American history, not just during what they know as the Trail of Tears. And then tribes are allotted funds for education in 1972. And it wasn't until 1978 that the Religious Freedom Act is passed, which is very interesting because if they're granted citizenship here with the 1924 Snyder Act, according to our Constitution, all American citizens have the right to vote, but that doesn't happen until later. And then also, all American citizens have the freedom of religion, but it takes a specific act to be passed for that to be applied to American Indian people.
So if you choose to use this activity, again, you can use whatever pieces of federal policy or whatever markers in there. You don't have to use exactly what I use, but it's just a really great way. Seems like you could create a digital version of something like this on Google Slides or something for remote teaching too. Maybe you can, Nate, but this is Jordan. I'm old school, but yes, you
could
definitely
do an interactive matching.
Any other person probably could. Yes, any other person probably could. It's just a really great way to provide them with information and just kind of also check where they're at and what they believe to be true. And then don't have them glue it down, have them put it in order. And then I go through it as a class and debrief that way. And I have my fun facts and then they're right in front of me and I sound smart because I got it all written. But also, it's really interesting to see not only students, but also educators coming into a situation of what they believe to be true based on specific events in history or what they believe to be true about American Indian people and say, actually, no, that's not the order that it happened in, and have them go, wait, what? That's, and I know that it's a little bit discombobulating too, but that restructuring the schema is very important. That's where the real learning happens. And also too, when people find out that the things that they thought to be true are not in fact true, that's also when the listening happens, because they're like, wait, what? Explain that to me. If you have your cheat sheet in front of you, you're smart. You got all the answers right there. So
yeah, it really does give them, it's really cool to see people do it and figure out, like, I definitely thought that, when they got the right to vote, they would also have religious freedom because those all come together. And then they see, all of those different discrepancies. So really great to upset the brain a little bit, which is good. Whoops. I forgot to show you this slide. These are some of the books. They're in your resource folder as well from when I was talking about boarding schools. So you don't have to hurry up and try and write down these titles, but there's a lot of great books out there in terms of boarding schools. Miranda just got sick of typing and talking, so she put pictures in there. All right. This is out of our resource Birthright, and that's the collection of Montana poetry from American Indian poets. So I would like us to take a couple moments to read this poem. It's one of those fun poems where not everything has to rhyme, and just reflect in the chat some federal policies that you might see popping out. What time era might this poem be discussing? I always tell my students that those poems that don't rhyme still tell a story. There's still a message in it. So what's going on in here? Maybe what federal policies can you identify, or maybe time eras can you identify? And then we can debrief. A couple more moments. What federal policies do you see within this text, or maybe what time eras do you see within this text?
Seeing some good responses. So this story or this poem actually covers several different federal policies. So we have time immemorial because there is a flashback of many times it was good to hear many people sing, for there were none who wanted anything more. And if the brown land seemed empty, there was always food to find. So that idea of self-sufficiency and being able to take care of yourself and your people. So we have time immemorial, we have the treaty era, and it also extends through the reservation period and also self-determination. We'll talk about self-determination at the end, but I might ask my students to just explain to me, so what is this about? What is happening? And then we go through the poem together. So who is the Great White Father? That refers to the President of the United States. This poem is a great example of unfulfilled promises, something that we talked about during the unpacking Essential Understanding 5. And also the reservation for Essential Understanding 4 is this promise of annuity payment or annual forms of payment. So a lot of times tribes through their treaties documents were promised things like food stipends, and that had a lot to do with the fact that they weren't able to leave the reservation anymore. Once the reservations were established, that was their place. And so they lost their ability or the self-sufficiency to be able to take care of their people and feed their people. Government said, oh, no, it's okay, we'll take care of it, we'll take care of it. But in this case and so many other cases, that promise, that treaty obligation was not fulfilled, and the people stood hungry and cold, just waiting. I asked my students, what are the people having to do? We just went over this poem actually yesterday as well in class for English. And I asked my students, what are the people having to do? So they, many horses slain to fill one's kettle. They're having to kill and eat their own horses. Many rawhide bags boiled to fill one's belly. I took out a piece of rawhide and made sure that they understand what rawhide actually is that was being boiled, and little pieces of it eaten to fill one's belly. Then again, that reference to time immemorial, and people were happy. Many times it was good to hear many people sing, for there were none who wanted any more. And then again, that self-sufficiency piece with there was always food to find. We could always take care of ourselves. And then I asked them, why is this a poem about resiliency though? Why might it be called Encampment of Power? Because even though it talks about people going through these hardships from generation to generation, we have inherited many hardships, and the Great White Father did not help the same old story told. But also this is a powerful piece, an example of resiliency, because this native author is alive and able to still tell this story, still articulate these historical events. And that's what resiliency is it's despite hardships, you still overcome, you are still here. I don't ever want my students to think that they were conquered or defeated. There might have been circumstances where battles were lost and things like that took place, but the simple fact that my children are alive and sitting in class is powerful. That's a piece of resiliency, and that's very important for them to know that this is a piece of where they came from. This is their ancestors, and we're faced with things a lot of times in life where situations get really tough, but always know that within you is that resiliency piece, that ability to survive despite these generations of hardship. I think is really important emotionally for my children as well.
I got to come into the end of her class the other day when she was talking about this with the students, and it was really cool to see their interaction and interpretation of that.
I paid Miranda to say that.
All right. I am going to share with you another video. This video is going to talk about multiple lessons that are featured on OPI's website. And if we have time, I'll kind of show you where those are at, because it's a grouping of lessons that I'm going to talk about that could be used as individual lessons or as a unit.
Hi, I would like to feature a series of resources on the OPI website pertaining to federal policy. So if you go to the OPI website under the Indian Education for All Resources tab, where you can find all of those different subject areas, and go to Social Studies and looking in the 6th through 8th grade category, you are going to find a list of OPI lessons pertaining to federal policy. Now, while these are in the Social Studies tab and they are in the Middle School tab, these lessons are written in such a way where you could really make it work for your grade level and your subject area. It can be kind of daunting to think about taking on federal policy and how you might teach that with students. So these are written from a social studies perspective with lots of writing opportunities, lots of English opportunities. If you are a specific content teacher, if you are a upper elementary teacher and you are teaching multiple subjects, you could even collaborate. I know some of our upper elementary teachers do certain subjects and they kind of prepare our students for middle school in that way. So lots of opportunities here to adapt and to collaborate with other teachers in meaningful ways. So a couple of the federal policy lesson plans that are featured go in this order. You could really take all of these individually and make them work for you, or you could teach them as a unit, which could be a really cool opportunity. The American Indian Boarding Schools is the first featured federal policy lesson plan, and your students are going to have the opportunity to create timelines, gather information from various resources, looking at multiple books, looking at video resources. And this could be a really cool collaboration between social studies and English teachers, because there are opportunities to be incorporating books and reading larger chapter books and writing reflections and learning a little bit more of the historical side of boarding schools. The thing that I like the most about this is creating that timeline and really giving our students the opportunity to see that boarding schools are not that far away from their understanding of history. There's also a lesson on the treaty period, which is really giving students a deep dive into understanding treaties and what they are, what they meant when they happened, and what they mean today, because the treaty period really has set up a lot of federal policy that we have today. So it's interesting to be able to investigate that kind of cause and effect of how federal policy is made today because of treaties that were made during that time. You're also going to be investigating primary source documents, and there are links and resources in this lesson plan to be able to find those. In the termination lesson plan, you're going to come at this from a perspective of empathy. The students are going to be put into a scenario where you're talking about how would you feel if this was happening to you. There's a resource that is video-based and includes interviews and kind of a documentary style from the Montana Mosaic series. And then they're going to write their reactions, articulating their understanding of what termination is and looking into how would they feel if they were put into those same circumstances and situations. We also have the tribal reorganization period. And so in this lesson plan, students are critically reading the Indian Reorganization Act, which is a great opportunity to talk about law and policy. And, you know, when the legislature is making laws and it's a 150-page document, what does that entail? What does that mean? Why does it have to include so many specific things? So you can really kind of dive deep into that critical reading of those kinds of primary source documents. And also there are writing prompts and opportunities to ask questions about how they feel, how they interpret, how they understand tribal reorganization. And then the last featured resource talks about self-determination, the self-determination era. And students are going to investigate the Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act of 1975. And then they are going to be able to research contemporary examples of self-determination. And so there are resources in here talking about places that they could research contemporary examples. I would suggest incorporating contemporary issues, and Jordan will talk a little bit more about that, but being able to use contemporary issues to say, This is a demonstration of self-determination. This is helping sovereignty. This is maybe hurting sovereignty. And the wonderful thing about these lesson plans is that they're going to be covering more than just essential understanding number 5. There is going to be an overlap all the time of talking about diversity in tribes and individuals. Culture is alive and well. We're going to be really hitting multiple essential understandings if you take on any of these lesson plans, or even if you're taking them on as a unit, which I think would be really cool to see.
Those lesson plans are located on the OPI website, but we also found out that Indian Ed for All, for OPI, is going to be updating those lesson plans to reflect the new state standards and links to new and updated resources, which is a good thing. It's always good to check back. Like, let's say you've become familiar with a lesson plan that's featured on the website. It's always good to check back to it, because our staff at OPI really does try to make sure things are updated and contemporary, and the best resources that can go along with those lesson plans are featured. I am going to, first I have to open the internet to be able to share the internet with you. One moment. I wanted to show you where these are located and just make a point about how sometimes we forget. My computer is not cooperating with me.
Nate can help you. He's techie.
He can make an interactive slide.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to go to OPI. And whenever you're going to OPI from Montana, I just usually type in OPI.
There's also an OPI nail polish. Make sure that you add Montana or MT into what you're Google searching. Otherwise, you will be on the Nail Polish of America website. I'm not kidding.
I know you're not.
Okay.
I've made the mistake several times when I'm trying to get to the website. So when you're in this area and you're looking at these different tabbed resources, you can go to the social studies, and let me look, let's see, here in the high school. But you could really take some of these activities and differentiate or scaffold for what's right for your classroom. I also really do think that the federal policy is such an awesome opportunity to collaborate with other teachers, because you can be working in social studies on the historical perspective of things, and then you can be working in English on reading and gathering more information, doing writing responses, those kinds of things. But other teachers can get involved too. You know, the art teacher can have students be making art that is reflective of what they're learning, and making those historical pieces based on historical information. So it was really cool. So these are featured right here. But again, I said that OPI has let us know that they're going to be updating these. And anytime that you're looking through and you're finding lesson plans, hopefully the more familiar you get with these different time periods. I know that it's, if you're new to learning about them, when we're jumping around and talking about the different ones, it can be kind of overwhelming to think about the different there, because there's so many of them and they all have different parts. Don't be afraid to reconnect with them over and over again. It does take some time to learn them and know them off the top of your head. But when you get more familiar, just like when you get more familiar with the essential understandings, you will be able to see resources and say, that's something I can use to help me with teaching this thing. And you can really sneak federal policy into so many conversations. You've seen us talk about contemporary issues. We've seen us talk about history and social studies and ELA. There's a lot of ways to sneak that in. And so I want to show you a book resource, and something that I think is a resource that everybody should have access to, because it really does encompass whoops, I'll just go through like this. It really does encompass all of the federal policies. So if you're not familiar with this book that's called The People Shall Continue, I've included both versions of the cover in case you're going to look to buy this, and like my version looks like this, but one of the updated versions is like the one on the right. And in your resource folder, I have linked from Lee and Low books. Lee and Low is a multicultural and diversity oriented publishing house and book resource where you can order books from. And they also create teacher guides. And there is a very extensive, I've broken it down to talk with you here, but it's like a 13-page resource guide in its tiny font with incredibly valuable activities, questions, and ways that anyone with any understanding of federal timelines and federal history could jump in and make use of this resource. I'm going to, so the way that this book is formatted, it was originally published in 1977, really ahead of its time. Also, a Native American author, Native American artist, kind of in response to and around the time of that Self-Determination Act, a couple years later. So really timely and so still contemporary today to what we see going on in the world. Obviously, history hasn't changed. It can look back and see and talk about those different things. And so the way it's formatted is each page, it's told like an oral story, oral history story, where when you're reading it, you can feel that it is written like the spoken word and written in a way where it's kind of almost like poetry, where there's repetition, there's pause and emphasis on certain phrases and structures, and it really takes on history of the people. It's called The People Shall Continue, and in the resource guide, it refers to the people. It refers specifically to some tribes and some prominent leaders of tribes. So you're getting a lot of diversity in tribes, diversity in individuals. You're seeing contemporary examples. You're seeing cultures alive and well. It talks about reservations. You're going to really hit on almost all of the essential understandings and all of the federal time periods. That's a lot of bang for your buck. We're really trying to make sure anytime we can double dip on content, that this is one of those ones that really does a great job. And so I'm just going to read one little line from it because I can't read too much because copyright.
Because federal policy.
We don't want to get in trouble. So like this part of the book, this page is introducing the concept of treaties. And it says, the leaders of the people agreed to treaties. The people said they would stop their armed fight, and the Americans promised to the people they could live on the land they both agreed was the people's land. And so there's a common theme of land throughout, and introducing that idea of like, this is how these things were agreed to originally, and how did that change over time, and what does that look like? So I want to just kind of talk about some of the featured things that are in this resource guide, which again is linked in your resource folder on the resources list. It has a pretty extensive vocabulary list, both literal and historical. It has questions and activities you can do before reading to give background, or to give students, if you're using this to introduce federal policy, you could give some students like predictive questions. They can look at the cover and the title and, how does this relate to what you think it might be about? There are activities you can do while reading this book. It's definitely something you could read more than once or revisit more than once, or even take page by page if you're talking about a certain time period. So taking a picture walk and looking at the pictures in the book and having students write summaries about what's happening here, what's the federal policy, using some of those questions that Jordan was talking about when she was talking about political cartoons and memes. You could really adapt that to what federal policy is being referenced in this part of the book and in this image, and what are they saying happened. We haven't got to essential understanding number 6, but you're going to find this as being a part of that kind of history from both sides. Setting a purpose for your listening. There's questions in there. There's questions for after your reading and activities. You can do literal questions like comprehension questions. There are extensions and higher learning questions. But the thing that I'm most excited in this teacher guide about is there's a section for ELL and ESL learning activities. So if you're not familiar with those acronyms, ELL is English Language Learner and ESL is English as a Second Language. And per the federal standards and our state standards, American Indian students are often identified as English language learners due to historical language structures. And so what that means is that they are getting services from the English language, the ELL department, and getting more focused content on their literacy. And so when that happens, you are wanting to give students as much access to practicing listening, speaking, writing, and reading. And that's good for all kids. So anytime you see something that's an ELL or an ESL activity, it's good practice for all kids. It doesn't just have to be for your kids that are identified that way. So thinking about like having students write questions they have about what they read, and then pairing them in small groups and having them come up with answers to the questions, exploring those questions. So you're giving students a chance to write, you're giving students a chance to speak when they're coming into small groups together, and a chance to read because they're going to have to research and maybe go back and reread to answer questions that they didn't understand. Also reviewing the illustrations, like I said earlier, that picture walk, if you're having them write summaries, they're verbalizing something that they're seeing. That's a practicing speaking. You can do it as a whole group and then go to small group. That's a practice that Jordan does really well with her students is, I swear she's not paying me, she's just a good teacher, is having students talk about it whole group first, and then being able to write about it. So they've heard, if they don't know off the top of their head the answers to the questions or what to start with, then they've heard conversation, hopefully participated in conversation, and have background knowledge now to be able to answer in written format, whatever those topics may be. And that can work both ways too. You can have students work individually to write their ideas down first, then share with a partner, and then the partners can share a whole group. And so you're giving students the chance again to write, speak, listen, and hear. Super important for our students. Our students are often, I don't want to say disproportionately, but higher identified as ELL and receive those services. And so we want to make sure that we are giving them all of the opportunity to practice those things so that they can work their way out and not have to be identified that way, to not have to receive those services because they've come to a point where academic language and those 4 areas are something that they are fluent and practiced in because of the instruction that they've received.
I teach, you teach, we teach.
Yeah.
Method.
Tried and true.
Speaking of that, I teach, you teach, we teach is come to the part.
Can I show that one resource really quick?
It is not
Okay.
come to the part
Sorry.
yet.
I want to show really quick. I didn't know if we would have time, but I think I can sneak it in. A resource that is online for talking about rights and laws and treaties and how they've changed over time, because that's a great part of federal policy. So incorporating maps, like we've talked about before when we talked about reservations, you can utilize that to talk about treaties and how they've changed. But this website called recordofrights.org is museum based and part of the National Archives, and you can go through and look at historical and primary source documents. It's interactive. So for example, if we wanted to look at the Indian Removal Act, we could look at primary source documents. There's a lot of great history kind of explaining what's happening and other documents that relate to it. So for example, we have the Indian Removal Act here, where we could click on this and read it, but then we could also have Jackson's message on Indian removal, that great Andrew Jackson guy. The Memorial of the Cherokee that was written in 1829. So this is something I suggest that you take some time to explore, especially if you are into using primary source documents. This has other things on there in terms of rights, but this has a great resource for Native American rights and historical documents and primary source documents. So now it is the time.
Speaking of the I teach, you teach, we teach method, please, if you can, reflect in the chat the memory device that we have gone over for essential understandings 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we will move on to 5.
Remember, there's a prize on the last day.
I'm going to do a prize now.
Oh,
well, not now, not like in 5 minutes, but let's see. So how do we remember essential understandings 1, 2, 3, and 4?
I kind of prefer the one boo.
But we know what you meant. All right, a couple more moments. Lisa, Kathy, Melanie. What's up? All right. So, can anybody guess what 5 is?
Oh, that's a good guess.
Ah, that's good.
That's also a good
Mine
guess.
is less poetic than that. And again, these devices, if you can think of something, which I'm sure you can, far more creative than myself, please feel free to do it. This is just a way that I incorporate it into my classroom and teach my students. But also, if you don't have students or this isn't at your grade level or applicable to you, the essential understandings are just a really great way to vet resources too. So if they comply with those essential understandings, then the information or the content that you're sharing with people is accurate. 5, take a dive, a deeper dive, that is. Dig it. All right.
Thanks.
So mine is less creative than yours, but 5. I couldn't, I guess maybe I didn't try hard enough, but I couldn't think of anything that rhymed with 5 that was also applicable to. So 5 starts with the same letter of the alphabet as federal. And so the summary of essential understanding 5 is that many federal policies have been put into place that have affected American Indian people. How do we explain that to others? These policies or laws conflicted with each other and continually change, making it difficult for tribes and individuals. These policies or laws make American Indians the most regulated or controlled group of people in the history of the United States. As we move through self-determination, tribes are able to become stronger nations. 5 starts with federal, but you came up with more poetic things than me. So 5, federal, same letter of the alphabet. So we have 1, fun, hot cross bun, diversity among tribes. Tribes differed in religion. To teach religion, tribes spoke different languages. Tribes lived in different locations, so they have different resources that affect their practice, jobs, and traditions, beliefs, governments. Also, tribes have different locations and practices. They have different histories, homes, and different uses for things. 2, no 2. The summary for essential understanding is diversity among individuals. And that can also cross-reference essential understanding 1 and how they differed, but the way that we explain that to people is that there are no generic American Indians, just like there are no exact copies of anyone. 3 tree, I made the tree myself. 3 rhymes with tree. Culture is alive and well. When we think of culture and trees, culture is like a tree because there are parts of you that you see and parts that are less visible. Culture and trees are seasonal. You can see different things in parts at different times. Culture and trees reproduce. There's a transfer of some things or all things. Culture and trees are resilient and can withstand anything. Culture and trees evolve and change over time, and culture and trees can be replenished. Culture goes far beyond the powwows and regalia that are visible. 4, door. 4 rhymes with door. The reason that a door is our symbol for EU4 is because when we think of the front door, we think of our home base. And the summary of that is through treaties and other agreements between governments, reservation land is reserved by tribes, for tribes. How do we explain that to others? You cannot give someone something that already belongs to them or a place that they have already occupied. And then 5, federal.
So hopefully that's helping stick and cement some things in your head about remembering those complex and layered essential understandings that we've been going through together. I know that it snuck its way into my brain since Jordan's been teaching that way to our kids, that it helps me remember too. So with that, I know Jennifer has opened up the survey. Please give us some feedback. We love to see that. It's anonymous for us. It helps us going forward to know what is most helpful to you and valuable to you as an educator or whatever position you hold, that this is interesting information for you. And if you would like, I would also enjoy that you reflect in the chat on our way out just where you think you might start with federal policy in your work.
I also put in the chat our righttrailed@gmail.com for any additional questions or clarifying some things that we went over tonight. So feel free to email us.
And if you want that email, and we're obviously no longer on here, it's on your resource list as well.
Thank you, ladies, so very much. And just a few quick notes. We are having a best practices conference this year. It will be on May 15th and 16th. Pre-registration is open. We are still putting together a really phenomenal virtual conference for you this year. It will be free. That is on our professional development offerings webpage. I've also posted the link in the chat. Also, due to all the spring breaks, which Miranda and Jordan are just about to be on in a minute and a half, we will not have a next deeper dive workshop until April 28th. And if you are doing also the Unpacking the Essential Understandings webinar series, that next one will not be until April 21st. So thank you, Jordan and Miranda, once again for a fun-filled and very packed workshop with lots and lots of information. These are so dense, and I'm so glad we've had this opportunity to do the deeper dives into them and really get into some of the resources. So hopefully you all are finding this equally as useful. Please let us know on the feedback form. Again, that'll be closing in 24 hours. And if you do get a spring break, if you're lucky enough, I hope you enjoy it, are safe and healthy, and we will see you back here on April 28th.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.